So the Steelworkers Archives, over the past couple of years, worked collaboratively with Lehigh University on a Mellon Foundation funded project that looked at women in Bethlehem steel. So much of the material that has been written about Bethlehem Steel and about the plant here in South Bethlehem has focused on men, right, as men were most of the workers, and on men working and managing the steel. But of course, women play very, very important roles in the steel as well. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Rosie the Riveter era, the World War II era at the Bethlehem plant and women's role in that. And then we're going to go over to Jeanne Brugger, who comes from a steelworking family, a long lineage of steel workers herself, and who was literally, I think, perhaps the first woman to go back into the plant on the shop floor in 1973. So really a pioneer in terms of bringing women back into the plant where they hadn't been since World War II. So that's what we will do. Can you hear me in the back? Okay, good. So as you know, probably, World War II, was incredibly important for the Bethlehem Steel plant here in Bethlehem, as the steel industry was instrumental in producing armaments and war material for the World War II effort. And you may not know this, but Bethlehem Steel actually supplied both the Axis and the Allies with war material before the United States entered the war. So the company was selling pig iron and scrap metal to Japan, for example, in 1936. And the United States as a whole didn't shut down war essential exports to Japan until 1940, as we were heading towards war. Shipbuilding, of course, was a major area of expansion, and this South Bethlehem plant, as is very well documented in a book written by Donald Young, sitting right over here, and Ann Bartholomew, which I believe the NMIH has in their store, wonderful pictorial history of Bethlehem Steel, shows that the South Bethlehem plant made a lot of steel. They made for the war, right here, right? They made steel that was used in the shipbuilding yards. They made armor plate. They made gun forging, shells, bombs, torpedoes, forged armor, etc., etc., etc. And since during the war, there was a huge expansion, including the building of a number of new forging areas in what is East Lehigh, part of the plant. And many young men were being drafted or volunteering to go fight in the war. The steel company faced a labor shortage here at the South Bethlehem plant. And so to address that labor shortage, they turned to women. Women had worked at the steel before in World War I, but many more were hired in World War II. We think about 2,200 women worked here at South Bethlehem during World War II. Across the country, women were working in mines and steel yards and shipyards and fabricating shops and in railroads. And by 1944, about 53 different types of manual labor were being done by women. And the number of women working doubled between 1940 and 1945. But most women, we have this Rosie the Riveter idea, and that was part of the U.S. government's propaganda. They had a whole public relations campaign to get women to work during World War II as labor was needed. But most women actually weren't working in manufacturing. So our image is of Rosie the Riveter, and it's women working in industrial jobs like the Bethlehem plant. But many women were moving into non-industrial jobs, right, in order to work during this period as well. But there were certainly a number of women at the Bethlehem plant. So just to give you a quick example, the No. 3 Forge shop that made shells for the Army and Navy, of 1,500 workers working there during World War II, 1/3 were women. Okay. Number 5 forge, which was making armor-piercing shells, had about 922 workers in 1943, and of those, 388 were women, right? So significant numbers of women were coming into the plant. And in this collaboration with Lehigh University, there's a website called Beyond Steel, which has a number of oral histories with women and men. And it's an interesting website because a professor at Lehigh University did a number of interviews in 1975. So many of those oral histories are people who actually worked at the plant during World War II, and people are reflecting on that, including women. And then more recent oral histories, including Jeanne Brugger's, that were done recently and added to this website. So in looking at the plant and women working in the plant in World War II, it's interesting that the Bethlehem Steel was very well prepared to bring women workers into the plant in World War II. For example, many of the women interviewed in 1975 remember going to training. There were training facilities set up at local high schools to train women in running machinery like lathes for a short training period before they moved into the plant. And that was part of the Selective Training and Reinvestment Act of 1940. In addition, women matrons were hired, not to work as foremen, but to work next to foremen in these forges that had significant numbers of women working in them. So the matrons were there to ensure that the needs of women workers were met, right? And were there to work with foremen to ensure that happened. Women, special rules were passed so that there were special safety rules that applied to women in the plant in World War II. And there were rules that didn't apply to men. For example, women were not allowed to work over 8 hours when they were working in the plant during World War II. That rule did not apply to men. Women at first were not allowed to operate cranes. That changed as the war movement moved on, and they really needed that labor more and more. Some of those rules got loosened up. And you know, it's interesting, this is the 1940s, right? The way that Nellie Ross, a matron, talks about it is these rules were put into place because while women were working in the plant, they also viewed these women as, quote, future mothers, right? So they wanted to ensure that they could work, but then safely go back into the community, into their traditional jobs as wife and mothers, right? There were welfare rooms constructed at East Lehigh, bathrooms, changing rooms for women. So those were there, part and parcel of preparing for women to enter the plant. And you know, special equipment was purchased so that women could wear equipment that was the right size for them, etc. So you know, the community was supportive of women working in the plant in World War II. The company was supportive of women working in the plant in World War II. And the government was supportive of women working in the plant in World War II. And the women who were interviewed about working during this period really said that their male co-workers were extremely helpful, very supportive, taught them, trained them on the job, etc. Nellie Ross, who was hired as a matron, said, quote, "That was the beginning of women's liberation. Quote, the women proved to the rest of the country they could do the same kind of job that any man could do, working in the plant during World War II. Of course, once the war was over and men returned from the war to come back to the steel mill, those jobs were defined as male jobs, right? And women then were told to leave and return home to their families. Nellie Ross describes this as, we were told, quote, pack your clothing and go home. We were pushed right back down again. So women left the plant, right, and went out again into the community. But what's interesting looking at the Lehigh Valley is that, you know, although they were moved out of the plant, most of the women did not move out of the labor force. In fact, we saw that nationally from 1940 to 1960, the number of married women working increased 3 times. So this World War II experience of Rosie the Riveter had a big impact on women and work, right? Probably contributing then to the women's movement of the 1960s and the 1970s. And women really, in part, working in the plant changed women, right? So Nellie Ross said, for example, quote, "I feel if I could work at the steel, I could do anything," right? She was confident that she could work and help support her family. Doris Moran said, quote, "It helped women to start to do things that men did before, that they depended on men to do." So women in these interviews really, report feeling confident about their ability to change gender roles at home and also to work within the community, although the reality is that most women then did have to move into lower paying jobs in the Lehigh Valley, jobs in the textile industry, jobs waitressing, jobs in the silk mills, right? Jobs that didn't pay the same kind of salary as as the steel mill jobs did. So that's just a short reflection on World War II. And so women moved out of the plant. They often, moved into different jobs. Women continued to work in the Lehigh Valley, although many women in steelworking families took some time out of their careers when their children were young, right? And then re-entered the labor force as their children went to school and got older. But the World War II experience was an important one for women in the Lehigh Valley. So after World War II, women did not re-enter the steel mill until the 1970s, okay? And this is what Jeanne will talk about, but the re-entry into the steel mill was a result of the civil rights movement of the 1960s and the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and a result of the women's movement. And because of various lawsuits being brought forward to the EEOC at Bethlehem Steel's Lackawanna plant near Buffalo and its Sparrows Point plant in Baltimore, black steelworkers made claims of discrimination within those 2 plants. There was a consent decree hammered out between the government, the EEOC, the corporation, the Bethlehem Steel Corporation, and the union, the United Steelworkers of America, that resulted in the 1974 consent decree, which was at that time the most extensive affirmative action plan in basic industry. And that 1974 consent decree, women were really added into it at the last minute almost. The National Organization for Women was instrumental in that, and so women became added to the consent decree. And I don't think any of these players were too happy about that, quite frankly. So by the time women came into the plant with Honi in 1973, there was a lot of resistance to this consent decree and the mandate that women be brought into the plant. And I think there was resistance on the part of the corporation, I think there was resistance on the part of the union, and I think there was resistance on the part of workers. Okay? So that brings us to Honi Brugger.
Give you a little bit of background. My great-grandfather worked at the main gate back in the days when you could show up with a chicken or some eggs or whatever, and that ensured you were going to get into work for the day. He told us a lot of funny stories about that, a live pig coming down one day and whatever. And he was one of the people that decided what kind of skills right on the spot did you have and where he could put you. And then he actually left because he was a masonry guy by trade, and he went to work for Brugger, building churches and buildings.
And what this is indicative of is
Okay.
a pre-union Bethlehem Steel, right? So before the union was recognized at Bethlehem Steel, workers hoped they could influence getting a job for the day by bringing
Right.
farm products to.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So anyway, then my grandfather, my father's father, came down and worked in the steel foundry. And back in those days, as the custom was, you could get pretty much the rest of your family in. So his brother also came into the steel foundry, and then subsequently my father and two of his brothers also worked there. And it was actually a flip of the coin. Management came to the steel foundry, and they had this big meeting, and they said they were going to give math tests to everybody. And so they took them, and the two highest people were Owen McFadden, who ended up becoming head of the local union, and my father, and they flipped a coin, and the loser would become salaried and start this incentive program. So we always got a good laugh out of that he was really considered the loser, that he got to go over to be salaried. But yeah, it was, back then, that wasn't really what you wanted to do, I guess. But my uncles teased him about that for the rest of his life, because they were all hourly. But we had, and my mother worked at textile back in the early days, before she met my dad, and then after they got married. And she actually ended up hearing about AFL-CIO, and she went up on Hamilton Street to talk to them and said, I would like you to come down to our shop and do this union thing. And so they came down, and the owner of the factory found out she was the one who brought him in, so he went over and slapped her silly, like she said, and they said, this isn't gonna happen. And she went out, they negotiated a pay for her, and they said to the company, we won't go to court for assault if you make arrangements for the union to go in. She marched in Philly with Eleanor Roosevelt. So there was quite a history in my background of both sides, the hourly side, the salaried side, and sometimes the animosity that was there as years went on. And when I had worked in accounts payable over in the North Building, which is a small building before, next to Martin Tower before it was built, and a friend of mine in salaried employment called me and said, we have a job opening in industrial engineering out in the plant. And at one time, like I said, that's what my dad, that was the start of the industrial engineering, setting these incentive rates. And she said, your dad can fill you in on the background, but I think you ought to come over and take the test. So I did. So they said, okay, we'll hire you. And I came over, and I started the same day as two other guys. And since I was first, I got to pick where I wanted to go, and they had a choice of Weldman, Inga Mall, and number 2 machine shop. Thank God I had always listened to my father and what went on where, so I picked number 2 machine shop, cleaner than the rest. And I started to be a rate setter there. And first day there, told me nobody wanted me there. My own boss, who was head of industrial engineering at number 2 machine shop, actually screamed at the guy who brought me down and said, we don't want any blank girls here. And that guy just left and went back up to the main building, and there I sat, thinking, well, this is a good start, right? So I tried to say something to him, and he left. And everybody I talked to there did not answer me. So I thought, well, this is absolutely crazy. I mean, I couldn't even fathom it. So I sat there. Time to go home. I went home. And I said to my dad, I can't believe this was my first day at work. No one would talk to me. The guy cursed at me. He's like, what? I'm like, I just can't believe it. And he's like, well, what did you do? I got nothing. I sat in the chair all day. You know, it just didn't make any sense. And he said, my mom goes, you're sticking it out. No matter what they say, no matter what they do, just stick it out, you're strong. So I went back the second day. Well, that went on for a whole week. Till finally, I stopped in the main office and I said, you know, it's pretty crazy that you're paying me money to sit in the chair all day and do nothing. And they're like, what are you talking about? And I said, nobody showed me the shop. I have no shoes, helmet, glasses. So then became the ordeal. I got the hat and the glasses. Nowhere could you buy shoes that would fit women's feet. So I ended up, the guy came in with a bunch of shoes, and I ended up wearing like 7 or 8 pairs of socks and a pair of steel tips so that I could walk without them flopping. And I had pretty big feet. That's what was crazy. But thankfully, that changed very quickly when other girls came in. Safety shoes said they would start getting women's things back in. But I got sent down into the shop, and I had someone very nice there said to me, look, I don't know why everybody's being like this to you. And he said, the boss is going to put you on night shift by yourself next week, so you better think about it, try and learn something. So what we do. So it was like a crash course with him that week. He was wonderful. He was one of the few guys in number 2 who was really nice to me. And so I studied at home. My dad told me basics, and he said, you'll be fine, just go do it, it's math, you know. So, okay, well, it's a lot more than just math. But at any rate, I started setting rates in number 2 machine shop. And needless to say, there were a lot of people who I knew from the community, people who went to my church, who called me names. They harassed me about going to the bathroom. We don't, you know, pretty basically, you can't use any bathroom out here. There was all men's bathrooms. And I went to use the women's room in the main part of the building where there was a clerk and a woman who filed, and they had a bathroom, and they told me I couldn't use theirs because I was a steel worker. And so it was just absolutely ridiculous and totally, to me, over my head, that I would, you know, just basic necessity of life was going to be so hard. So then what happened is they held a week of pay, and then 2 weeks later we got a pay. And the 2 guys I started with, one who went to Wellman and Ingeborg, called me, and they said, our first paycheck, let's go out to eat lunch. So I said, okay. So we walked out, and one of the guys had their car parked very close to the main gate, and we went to lunch, and they bring out their paychecks and go, look at this. I look, and I'm like, oh my God. They're earning almost $4 more an hour than I am. I never ate lunch. I left. I came back over to the main office and I said, no, this is not gonna happen. I'm doing the same thing they're doing, setting rates, just a different shop, which I could have been in one of those shops, and it's not happening. And they said, well, take it or leave it. So I said, I'm taking the afternoon off, and I went to Now. And I told Now, this is what's happening. They called up, they called me that night at home and said, come back in, we're adjusting your pay. And I insisted I get the back pay, which caused another fuss, but eventually that was cleared out. But I couldn't believe that they were gonna pay me $4 less at that time, an hour. It was a lot of money. And pretty basically, the reason I left accounts payable and came over for this job is because it was more money, you know? So anyway, number 2 machine shop. I worked there for about a year and a half when they decided I would fill in on vacation, so I ended up working Wellbin, Ingot Mole. Every time somebody in industrial relations that were setting rates had to go to vacation or sick or whatever. So I got around the plant pretty good. And then I got assigned to 12 roll. And that shop, I have to say, was one of the better shops where the majority of guys just thought, oh well, so what? And the foreman said I could use their shower room, which was in the office, a small shower room, but pretty basically they harassed me every time I went in to go to the bathroom, but at least I had a place to go. And that didn't happen in all the shops I went. It was absolutely ridiculous. One place they said you could use this small bathroom that belonged to somebody, and then they ripped the door off and said, okay, just so we could see what you're doing in there. It was so absolutely over the top to me that I couldn't believe it, and I just got more determined that they were not going to do this to me, and they weren't going to get away with it. And then in 1975, the head of labor relations called and said, we're hiring 75 girls, 50 are coming in tomorrow, and we would like you to meet with them and then go to the respective shops and try and set them up with places to go to the bathroom or whatever. Well, that was like off the top of his head. Well, what a good idea, she's been around, she could do this. Well, it was horrendous. It was horrendous. Every shop fought that the girls couldn't use any part of their bathrooms. Whatever, girls would have to get on the bus and drive to the one washroom, Alloy Tool Steel, up under the New Street Bridge had just closed down, and we took part of that welfare room and made it for girls. So they had to get on the bus, like, oh, I have to go to the bathroom, get on the bus, drive up there to go to the bathroom, get on the bus and come back. It was crazy. But a lot of those girls were the same way. It's good money, they were staying. So then they said, why don't you take an electrical engineer and a plumber and go around the plant, and you won't be setting rates for a while, and try and see where we can cut some rooms in half or whatever and make welfare rooms for women. Well, then needless to say, everybody in the plant hated me because we went to every single department, and we ended up putting some trailers in because it was our only option at the time, that we brought some trailers in, so put them kind of central to 2 or 3 shops where girls could go during the day and also take a shower before they went home. So needless to say, those very first years for girls coming in to work here was nothing like the experience that the women in World War II had. Nobody wanted them here. They harassed an awful lot of them in lots of ways, and we were just talking before this that guys had various pictures in their lockers on the walls, and more than just a pinup you'd see. And they told me I had to go tell everybody to take these out of their lockers. And so I'm like, oh, and what armed guard am I going with, right? Oh, you can convince them. So I went to every department and got abused and abused and abused. Don't tell us, it's our personal equipment. And I eventually went back and said, there has to be some kind of official statement about this that goes out, because no one's going to listen to me. And quite frankly, I took a lot of abuse. Your picture would be up there if you looked like these girls, you know, all the crazy things. So it was disheartening to me in this way, that these were sons and daughters of people who had worked here during World War II that were now working in the plant. And they couldn't understand that their mothers might have worked here, their aunts. And I just don't understand the mentality that changed. And I often say this, and I really do think it's something to it. When they would walk through the main gate, you would know them on the outside, they were the nicest people. They walked through the main gate, the curtain fell, and their personality changed. I have no other excuse for it, how they changed their personality when they came in here. But I often use the line of, God bless you, when someone would say something extremely vulgar to me, I would wait till they were done, and I started out saying your wife, and I changed it to your daughter, but I'd say, just think, there's some dirty old man talking to your wife like that right now. Or I'd say it about their daughter. Their daughter usually did it, because a lot of guys did have daughters, and if I'd say that, they'd go like, well, that's not happening to her. And I'd say, well, how do you know? Did you ever ask her what men are saying to her at work? Because I was thinking maybe this isn't just the steel industry, maybe it's everywhere. And I knew in accounts payable guys made cracks, but it wasn't so crude and rude as it was in the plant. So there were, and then in 1979 I went over to labor relations, and I worked for them, and I got put in charge of all health complaints that had to do with women, which turned out to be most health complaints. Did work with environmental, we did noise studies, we did conditions in different shops, because OSHA was always coming out with some kind of new rule we had to meet. So I was kind of a liaison for the girls to come about problems in all their welfare rooms. And we finally did get welfare rooms set up, but we had a lot of incidents. I'll tell you a story that's kind of funny to tell now, but it wasn't funny then. We took part of the press forge, which is part of Lehigh's foundries now, and they had 2-floor building that was huge. So we cut the first floor in half, built a wall, and made that the women's room. And the men had the whole second floor and part of the first floor. And there weren't that many guys who worked there. I mean, it was really kind of crazy. So I had all the girls that would put down the beam yards and the cinder dump, and they were all coming either walking or by bus to this central welfare room. So that changed after a while, but one day one of the girls called me and she said, we have a problem down here. And I said, what? She said, we can hear the men laughing and talking about us, but we don't know where it's coming from. So I drive down there, I go in, and there's nothing, I hear nothing. Well, of course, I figured they saw me pull up. So I went, I checked walls, I checked the ceiling, showers. I'm thinking, where could they possibly be? And I thought, well, it had to be coming from, they were just hearing the guys on the other side of this wall. Well, as it turns out, this is how we caught who was doing it. On the back side of that building was where the boilers were for hot water. And it was a small, long hallway with a big water boiler for the entire building. And the workmen who serviced those came in through a door. So apparently the word got out they were going to leave the door open, and the guys came in, and the wall that was up leading into that part of the welfare room was a fiber board of some kind, and it was riveted in. They took all the rivets out so that there would be a total hole going through, and they could see the girls taking a shower and getting changed. And so they would put the rivet back in so that if you came in, you could tell there was nothing wrong with the wall. And on the other side, of course, you couldn't see it. And one day the girls called me and they said, it's outrageous. So I got down there and I walked around the back. And I didn't see anybody around, and I thought, well, it's not back here. So as I walked around and came into the welfare room from the other door, they didn't see me come in, and I heard all this. And I walked back and I went like this on the wall, and when I did, somebody made a noise, and I was like this, and with that, they were trying to stick the rivets back in, and they knocked the whole wall over and came flying down, and here were these guys laying, and I'm like, oh my God. So needless to say, they scattered like little ants. There were 2 or 3 guys, I knew who it was. So I didn't say anything right then, but I went up and I said, we've got a real problem down there, and the guy who was in charge of that shop wasn't too friendly to me. So I said, I think I'm gonna need some backup to go down there. They're gonna have to pay, put a regular wall in. And it was guys from various shops. So somebody isn't getting to superintendents to tell them they've got to do something. Not that they can control every guy, but there has got to be something said